Now, just about to punch our tickets for a virtual tour of Waterford treasures. It's one and only Eamonn McEneaney.
Hey,
Eamonn, good morning to you.
Good morning, Mary. Good morning, Ollie. Good morning, listeners.
Today you're going to talk about the Ballybricken Jail, a part of Waterford associated with law and order for 4 centuries. Wow.
That's correct, yeah. That's the site, and we're talking about the site of the present Garda station. So 400 years ago, that was outside the town. The city walls ran there along the top of, and they're still there at the top of Patrick Street, and there's a big gate there at the top of Patrick Street, and you can still see part of the city wall at either side of that, and at the back of De La Salle School. So just to get people in the frame, outside the city at the time, then Queen Elizabeth, terrified of the Spanish coming into Ireland, and particularly into Waterford, because Waterford is a very Catholic city, even though it was loyal to the Queen, but she was terrified they'd come in here. She ordered a fort to be built on Ballybricken. Of course, that would overlook the river, and you could, with cannon, you could bomb ships from there, or attack ships from there. It never really much happened around that time, but by 1620, James the First of England, her successor, the King of Scotland and King of England, he built a big fort there, and parts of the walls of that fort are still to be seen up there in Ballybricken. And it's interesting, a drawing of it shows cannon faced not out at the river. Well, some are faced out of the river, but a lot of them are faced in towards the town, because of course James was trying to pursue a Protestant agenda, and he didn't trust the citizens of Waterford, so they're faced in towards the town, even though allegedly the fort was to protect the city. Then by 1745 the city decided to build a jail there, and we're told it was a really strong, a beautifully built jail.
If you're going to be in jail, it was a beautiful jail.
Yeah, it was apparently architecturally it was very beautiful, and the description has it had double iron gratings on the windows and on the drains and on the chimneys to stop people from escaping. No, it said it's quite commodious. Later on in the century, then the famous architect James Gandon, who built the Custom House in Dublin and all the great public buildings of Dublin, he came and he designed a beautiful courthouse there in the late 18th century, and it was regarded as a fine piece of architecture. Sadly, it was demolished to build a prison there, a bigger complex, which I've sent you on a photograph of that, so that will be there for the listeners. What happened in that jail, of course, there was a number of escapes from that jail, and one of them was the Connerys from West Waterford, and they escaped from there. A series, 2 brothers arranged escape of a lot of the people interred there, and in 1836, 2 brothers and a lot more of the prisoners escaped, and we were told in newspapers that there was loud cheers by the people of Ballybricken when they saw them scaling over the wall.
No way.
They were eventually recaptured and sent to Tasmania. But, the 19th century would have been a brutal enough time for people. There's a man called John Moran who in 1822 was whipped through Ballybricken.
God,
and then, of course,
times.
And then I was telling you some weeks ago about the gardener here in the Bishop's Palace. He was executed there in 1821. But then again, the report says he was the first man to be actually hung there since 1799. Of course, now would have been after the Great Rebellion, the 1798 rebellion, So his name was Darcy. So that was interesting. That old 18th century jail was demolished in 1861, and a new jail was built. And that's that big Gothic jail that you see in photographs. A very fine building for a jail, typical of what you'd see in the 19th century when they're trying to bring in some sort of reform. I mean, jails were still horrendous places, but by comparison to what they had been years earlier, they were trying to bring in some sort of reform. That new jail then is what would have dominated Ballybricken at the time. Huge high walls, and continued to be in operation even during the Free State when Ireland had its independence, eventually only closing at the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, when it was used by the LDF. And very sadly then the LDF used it to store turf, and put the turf up against the huge walls there at the back of the jail towards Barker Street. And sadly, with the heavy rains, the turf got very heavy because it soaked in the water, and of course fell down on the little houses there in Barker Street, and 9 people died that night, and really the biggest disaster in the city in the 20th century. 9 people died and on the night, and a 10th person died later on.
That's the commemoration of the Bull Poster.
That's right. That's right. That's commemoration of Ballybricken itself. Then in 1949 they decided to demolish the old jail. Pity they didn't leave part of it, because it was a fine piece of Gothic Victorian architecture. There's a lovely church there, an lovely gate. Obviously the big cells were pretty forbidding places, but cell blocks. But then the Department of Social Welfare, as we know, took over then in the 1950s, and in 1973 it went to be a Garda station again. So it's funny that little piece of ground just outside, what was just outside the city bounds at the time, outside the walls of the city, should be associated with law and order or defences in some manner or another for 400 years.
Absolutely, and the picture you sent is great. That'll go up online. Lovely aerial view, like an original old drone footage if they existed back in the day. Obviously,
exactly,
they didn't.
Yes. It's a fabulous
it's
photo.
A great photo
taken from an airplane.
It's amazing. Eamonn, thank you so much. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Talk to you tomorrow.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.